Africa was meant to stay silent while Europe's black-robed judges determined who among us deserved to be branded criminals. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger just destroyed that fantasy completely. With a single announcement, they incinerated the International Criminal Court's moral authority and revealed what it always was: a colonial tribunal masquerading as justice. For 20 years, the ICC pretended to represent universal law, yet it maintained only one hunting preserve: Africa. Bush remained untouchable, Blair stayed protected, Macron walks free, but African leaders became trophies for The Hague's collection. Now the Sahel has declared, enough, this isn't withdrawal, it's revolution. For the first time in decades, African nations have told the West, your laws don't chain us, your court doesn't rule us, your permission is no longer required. But what does this rebellion mean for Africa's future? Let's find out. The world awakened to headlines nobody predicted, though perhaps everyone should have seen coming. In the early morning hours of September 23, 2025, the military governments controlling Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger released a joint declaration that sliced through diplomatic pleasantries like a blade through silk. They announced immediate, unconditional withdrawal from the International Criminal Court. The message carried military precision, stern, uncompromising, stripped of the usual diplomatic hedging that accompanies such announcements. No review periods, no committees, no gradual transitions. A complete, final break. The court that once claimed to be the ultimate arbiter of international justice was denounced, in their exact words, as a tool of neo-colonial repression. In one coordinated action, 3 governments placed themselves beyond the reach of an institution that had loomed like a sword over their leadership, their armed forces, and their very sovereignty for years. The symbolic power of this decision defies overstatement. This represents far more than some technical withdrawal from an obscure international body. 3 African states have unanimously declared to Europe and the broader Western world, your courtroom will not determine our destiny. What makes this announcement explosive is its timing. These nations aren't peaceful democracies signing treaties during stable periods. They're countries gripped by insurgency, warfare, and political transformation. Each operates under military leadership that seized power through coups between 2020 and 2023. Each fights brutal campaigns against militants who have transformed the Sahel into the globe's deadliest conflict zone. Yet, instead of seeking international legitimacy through compliance with external scrutiny, they're rejecting it entirely. The sheer boldness has sent shockwaves through diplomatic establishments from Brussels to Washington. Reactions have been immediate and panicked. This explains Western nervousness perfectly. This transcends mere legal withdrawal. It represents a crack in the facade of international institutions that still claim universal authority while practicing selective enforcement. If 3 nations can walk away today, what prevents 5 more tomorrow? What happens if the African Union, already skeptical of the ICC, supports a mass exodus? Suddenly, the ICC's already fragile African legitimacy could collapse completely. The breaking news isn't simply that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are departing. The breaking news is that they've transformed the ICC itself into the defendant, putting the court on trial in global public opinion, exposing its hypocrisy to ordinary Africans who already suspected it. This accusation cannot be dismissed, regardless of how many press releases flow from The Hague. But why does this accusation cut so deeply? Why does it resonate not just across the Sahel, but throughout the continent? To understand that, we must examine the ICC's extensive African history, a record that explains why the Sahel's withdrawal feels less like an aberration and more like an inevitable breaking point. If the Sahel's withdrawal resembles a dam bursting, it's because pressure has been building for decades. The International Criminal Court didn't lose Africa overnight. It systematically destroyed its own credibility, brick by brick, case by case, until this rupture became unavoidable. To comprehend today's bitterness, you must revisit the court's continental record. Every indictment, every selective prosecution, every calculated omission was a wound that eventually bled into rebellion. When the ICC emerged in 2002, numerous African countries ranked among its earliest signatories. Genuine hope existed that the court would finally end the impunity that protected dictators and warlords. Leaders in Kampala, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa signed with sincere belief that justice would no longer privilege the powerful, but establish universal standards. That illusion shattered rapidly. The ICC's very first full investigations launched in Africa. Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Central African Republic became The Hague's testing grounds. Sudan's Omar al-Bashir soon became the first sitting head of state indicted by the court. Then came Kenya, Ivory Coast, Libya. The list expanded, and the map of ICC action increasingly resembled a map of Africa itself. Of the first 30 people indicted by the ICC, virtually all were African. This wasn't coincidence, it was structural. Powerful Western nations like the United States, Russia, and China never ratified the Rome Statute. They kept themselves outside the court's jurisdiction while encouraging African states to join. The result was a fundamentally tilted playing field. African leaders had opened their doors, and the ICC walked straight through, while Washington, Moscow, and Beijing kept theirs firmly locked. This imbalance meant that while George W. Bush could order Iraq's invasion without consequences, Sudanese generals found themselves facing international warrants. The African Union took notice. By the early 2010s, ICC frustration was boiling over. At summits, leaders accused the court of hunting Africans. They highlighted glaring double standards. Tony Blair never faced summons for Libya's disaster. Nicolas Sarkozy never confronted charges for his regime change role. Not a single Western general was prosecuted for civilian deaths in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, African presidents spent years in legal limbo, their reputations destroyed by cases that sometimes collapsed without convictions. But what deepened resentment wasn't just who got prosecuted, but who didn't. Colonial crimes remained untouched. France's brutal Rwandan role, Belgium's Congolese atrocities, Britain's Kenyan abuses, none appeared on The Hague's docket. By excluding historical injustices, the ICC seemed to Africans less like a justice tool and more like a weapon of amnesia, erasing Europe's sins while magnifying Africa's. Over time, this perception hardened into political reality. Burundi became the first country to formally withdraw in 2016, citing bias. South Africa briefly announced its own exit before reversing course. Kenya openly defied the court when its leaders faced indictment. The writing blazed across the wall. The ICC's African credibility hung by a thread. The thread snapped when the Sahel states decided they had nothing left to lose. Let's pause here to thank the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're joining a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. To understand why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger shredded their ICC membership, you must leave The Hague's marble halls and enter the dust and blood of the Sahel. This isn't Europe, where justice gets debated in seminar rooms. This is a region where villages burn at night, children disappear into armed groups, and entire provinces slip from government control. In such a landscape, sovereignty becomes a matter of life and death, not abstract principle. The collapse began over a decade ago when NATO's Libyan war cracked open Muammar Gaddafi's arsenal and flooded the Sahel with weapons. Militants, traffickers, and mercenaries poured south, embedding themselves in Mali's deserts and Niger's borderlands. What started as local rebellions metastasized into sprawling insurgent networks. Today, the Sahel is considered the world's deadliest conflict zone, with death tolls surpassing Middle Eastern conflicts. For the people of these countries, war has become daily rhythm. In central Mali, farmers fear planting crops because insurgents mine their fields. In Burkina Faso, entire towns stand empty, residents displaced into makeshift camps. In Niger, border regions have become battlefields where state authority evaporates at sunset. Civilians live trapped between insurgent brutality and the harsh countermeasures of overstretched armies. It was in this crucible that the old governments fell. Elected leaders dependent on foreign troops and donors couldn't contain the crisis. Soldiers who had lost comrades in ambushes, who saw families displaced, who fought without equipment, turned their weapons not just on insurgents, but on their own governments. The juntas now ruling aren't accidents. They're war's children. And here's where sovereignty becomes non-negotiable for these military leaders. Every foreign demand, every aid condition, every external investigation is viewed as a direct survival threat. They're fighting wars not of their making. They point to Libya's NATO-engineered collapse as the domino that triggered their current nightmare. Western powers lit the fire and now want to supervise how Africans extinguish it. This explains why the ICC, with its investigations into alleged state force abuses, became intolerable. In the Sahel, soldiers aren't distant figures. They're brothers, cousins, sons of the very communities under attack. To accuse them in The Hague is to criminalize defending one's homeland. The message from Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey rings clear. African armies will not be judged by outsiders for fighting wars that outsiders sparked. But sovereignty here isn't merely defensive, it's transformative. By rejecting institutions like the ICC, the juntas signal their intention to completely remake engagement rules. They no longer trust imported models of governance, justice, or security. Instead, they're building alliances that reflect new priorities. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, formed in 2023, isn't just a military pact. It's a declaration that regional self-reliance represents the only way forward. French troops have been expelled, Western bases are shrinking, and Russian advisors have been welcomed. The fight for the Sahel is being redefined as an African-led struggle, free from external dictates. Yet this raises a pressing dilemma. If sovereignty is asserted so fiercely, how will justice for atrocities be delivered? When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger vowed to build indigenous mechanisms for peace and justice, it wasn't rhetorical flourish. Here's a reminder to like and share this video and subscribe to our channel to watch more content on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue. It was a radical declaration that accountability's foundations must be rooted in African soil, not imported from Europe. The question echoing across the Sahel is simple. If not the ICC, then what? The answer increasingly becomes justice shaped by Africans for Africans. This isn't unprecedented. Long before modern states or international tribunals existed, African societies maintained intricate systems for resolving disputes, punishing wrongdoing, and restoring social harmony. Justice was never about isolating offenders in cells thousands of miles away. It was about mending communities torn by violence. Consider Rwanda's Gacaca courts after the 1994 genocide. Over 1 million cases were heard in community-led settings where perpetrators and survivors confronted each other face to face. It wasn't perfect. Critics noted inconsistencies. But it achieved something. The Hague never could. Speed, inclusivity, and genuine reconciliation attempts. In Ghana, traditional chiefs and councils of elders still mediate land disputes and family conflicts using dialogue-based methods rather than endless litigation. In West African Islamic traditions, Sharia courts have historically provided localized accountability systems where secular state justice was absent. The Sahel's military leaders are tapping into this legacy with modern adaptations. They're not proposing to abandon courts or laws, but to weave together customary practices, community authority, and national frameworks into something distinctively African. Truth-telling commissions could document atrocities in local languages, led not by foreign lawyers but by respected community figures. Hybrid courts might combine professional judges with elders or religious leaders, ensuring verdicts carry both legal and cultural legitimacy. Reparations could take the form not just of monetary compensation, but of rebuilding destroyed villages, restoring farmland, or reintegrating ex-combatants through community service. Such mechanisms would address a deep frustration: distance. For many Africans, the ICC in The Hague remains a distant abstraction, disconnected from their lived experiences. Victims rarely witness proceedings. Communities rarely feel closure. Indigenous systems, by contrast, bring justice to the people. Hearings could occur in town squares, with testimony recorded for history and communities witnessing accountability unfold in real time. But Indigenous justice's promise isn't just about process, it's about sovereignty. For too long, Africa's accountability narrative has been written elsewhere. Colonial powers imposed courts that criminalized resistance while excusing their own violence. Post-colonial leaders often relied on external donors to design reforms. Now the Sahel declares, we will not outsource our conscience. Justice will not be dictated by bureaucrats in New York or judges in The Hague. It will emerge from the soil of places like Mopti, Timbuktu, and Kaya, places where blood has been spilled and where healing is urgently needed. The challenges remain formidable. Yet, even with these uncertainties, one thing is clear. The ICC withdrawal wasn't a leap into void. It was a leap into possibility. By reviving indigenous justice, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are sketching an alternative model's outline, one that rejects the assumption that Europe is law and morality's sole custodian. They're reclaiming the right to judge themselves, to confront their own wounds in their own way. This brings us to the larger battlefield, not the Sahel's deserts but the global stage. Because if Africa can prove it can deliver credible justice on its own terms, it won't just undermine the ICC. It will redefine Africa's place in the international order. Which raises the final question: how will this bold defiance reshape Africa's geopolitical standing? What does it mean for its relationship with the West? The answer stretches far beyond Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. This isn't only about the Sahel, it's about Africa's future place in the global system. With one declaration, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have transformed themselves from defendants into challengers, forcing the world to confront a question it has long avoided. What happens when Africa no longer plays by rules it didn't write? The first tremor is political. For years, international institutions have functioned as Western influence levers. The ICC, IMF, and World Bank all carried the same unspoken message. Compliance was rewarded, defiance was punished. By walking away from the ICC, the Sahel Trio has demonstrated that these levers no longer guarantee control. If 3 of the world's poorest nations can reject The Hague without collapsing, what stops larger powers like South Africa, Nigeria, or Ethiopia from considering the same? The precedent is dangerous for the West. The second tremor is regional. The alliance of Sahel states, AES, is no longer just a military pact. It's becoming a symbol of African defiance. Expelling French troops, rejecting donor dependency, and now exiting the ICC, the AES is carving out a blueprint for sovereignty in practice. Other African blocs are watching. In East Africa, where ICC resentment already runs strong, leaders may feel emboldened to reassert their autonomy. In North Africa, where colonial scars run deep, this withdrawal could reignite debates about Europe's lingering grip on African affairs. What began as Sahelian revolt could cascade into continental realignment. The third tremor is global. Africa's pivot away from Western institutions is happening alongside a pivot toward alternative partners: Russia, China, Turkey, and even intra-African alliances. The ICC withdrawal aligns perfectly with this trend. By rejecting a court perceived as European, the Sahel states are positioning themselves within a multipolar order where power is contested, not monopolized. The West fears this because legal legitimacy has always been its last weapon. Military bases may be shut down, corporations may be replaced, but as long as courts in The Hague could summon African leaders, the control illusion endured. That illusion is now breaking. But this move isn't just about defiance, it's also about imagination. If Africa is serious about leaving behind external models, it must build its own. The idea of an African court of sovereign justice is no longer fantasy. It could emerge under the African Union, with judges drawn from across the continent, combining modern legal standards with African reconciliation traditions. Such an institution would not only serve Africans but would prove to the world that justice doesn't need to flow from Europe to be legitimate. The West will undoubtedly resist. Expect narratives about impunity, about juntas protecting themselves, about victims left without justice. But those narratives ring hollow when the very same West shields its own leaders from accountability. The hypocrisy is transparent. Washington never signed the Rome Statute. London shrugs off Iraq questions. Paris evades scrutiny for its Sahel campaigns. Why should Africans accept a system that spares the strong and cages the weak? By leaving the ICC, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger haven't ended the pursuit of justice, they've reclaimed its ownership. They're asserting that African blood will not be weighed differently from Western blood. They're declaring that the same moral standards must apply to Paris and Washington as they do to Bamako and Ouagadougou. By doing so, they're reshaping the conversation on sovereignty itself. The stakes are enormous. If Africa succeeds in crafting its own justice mechanisms, it will no longer be history's subject, but its author. If it fails, the West will point to the collapse as proof that Africans cannot govern themselves without external supervision. But for now, the symbolism is undeniable. Africa has set fire to the old script and dared to write a new one. If the ICC never touched Western leaders, why should Africans still trust it? Do you believe Africa can build its own system of justice stronger than The Hague? Let us know in the comments section. Is this the moment Africa finally breaks free from neo-colonial control? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring you videos on something nobody talks about: Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.